Hello and welcome to the Khayrion podcast, your guide to everything concerning the politics and business of the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. Hello and welcome, dear listeners. My name is Katarina Hildebrand. I'm the CEO of Khayrion, and my dear guest today is Dr. Elias Dahrouge from the St. Joseph University in Beirut and Khayrion's Research Lead. Welcome, Elias.
Thank you.
Today, we are going to talk about the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, which have stirred a lot of controversy in the past several months due to an array of aspects. One of them is the disarmament of Palestinian camps, and the other one was the heavily medialized, brutal death of Elio Abu Hanna, a 24-year-old biochemistry graduate who died after almost entering one of the Palestinian refugee camps. So, Elias, let's start with a brief overview. How many Palestinians are there in Lebanon? Where do they live? How did they get here? What is their demographics?
So, as you may know, Lebanon had a wave of Palestinian refugees arriving into Lebanon after the Palestinian Nakba in 1948. And these Palestinians, as they moved from mandatory Palestine to the neighboring countries, because many of them went to Syria, to Jordan as well, Egypt, Iraq, other countries, a significant number of them, especially those from the northern part of Galilee, they came into Lebanon. Now, at that time, the policy of the Lebanese state in 48-49 was to settle them into camps, refugee camps, around the main cities of Lebanon. So you have a dozen of camps in Lebanon that are actually scattered around the main cities. So you have, for example, in Tripoli, you have the Baddawi camp, for example, Nahr al-Barid next to Akkar. You also have around Beirut the famously known Shatila and its outskirts, which is Sabra. But also you have Ain al-Halwi next to Saida, and so on, Rashidiyya in Sur, and even in Baalbek. So the whole idea is that these Palestinians, they were supposed to stay as all refugee groups. Usually they intend to stay a few months, a few years, and then try to go back to their lands. Now, the Palestinians in Lebanon never had this chance. Up until today, they still don't have this chance, and they stayed in Lebanon. So why are we calling them anyway refugee camps? Although they are not camps anymore. You cannot live in a tent for more than 70 years. Actually, these camps, with time, from year to another, the tent was changed into a small wooden barrack. The wooden barrack became a small house made out of bricks. And then when the family extended, because you had children, they had to also find a refuge. So they built up a second store, a third store in a very uncontrolled manner, let's say, or without any urban planning. And this is how the Palestinian, what we call today Palestinian refugee camps, are actually a sort of something that would be more look like a favela in Brazil or elsewhere around the world. So an informal settlement where you have a lot of non-urbanly planned, very, very badly built houses, housing units. And the more time is going, the more stores are added, and which can be very dangerous. We know that some of these buildings are regularly collapsing. And in case of, for example, God forbids, a earthquake, this would be catastrophic for this area. So out of the original numbers of those who entered Lebanon, with time, these became today, officially, the numbers are almost something around 500,000. But these numbers are the numbers of UNRWA. UNRWA, which is the UN agency responsible of the Palestinian refugees, and is special for Palestinian refugees because all other refugee groups around the world are actually managed and under the UNHCR. But the Palestinians had the UNRWA. Now, according to their numbers, there are 500,000. But according to other numbers and censuses, this number is less than 230,000. Now, why this discrepancy, you may ask? The discrepancy is that many of these Palestinians, although living or registered as being refugees, Palestinian refugees of Lebanon, they actually, during the decades, they emigrated, they went to third countries, they established themselves in Europe, in the States, in other countries, in other continents. but they are still registered under UNRWA in Lebanon. Why? Because also when you have higher numbers registered, the UNRWA can also ask for more funds. So this is one of the main reasons. And also there is a political reason, because by registering them as being Palestinians of Lebanon, there will still a sort of a hope or a negotiation, an unexpected negotiation one day about their theoretical return to mandatory Palestine. This number would make a huge difference if it's bigger. But 230,000 out of them are currently living in Lebanon. And actually, less than half of them are actually living in the Palestinian camps. Because with time, a lot of them could find some kind of decent jobs, or those who immigrated started to finance back their relatives who stayed in Lebanon. And a lot of them actually established themselves outside of these camps in gatherings or in residential buildings. But the Palestinians in Lebanon have not many rights. Mainly, for example, they cannot own housing units. They cannot own property. Their labor is restricted to specific labor categories, usually low-skilled jobs. Why? Because the Lebanese state at that time didn't want them to be a sort of a competition to the local workforce. So you may ask how they can then establish themselves and live outside of these camps. Well, most of them, they have Lebanese friends, Lebanese relatives, because there are a lot of cases of intermarriage between them also. So if the mother is Lebanese, let's say, and the father is Palestinian, they could register the property in the name of the mother, the Lebanese mother. Or they would register the property in the name of a Lebanese friend of them. But you can imagine how volatile and marginalized the situation can be, because if they are in bad terms at some point with this friend can take over their own property.
These are extremely difficult situations. What other challenges do the Palestinians in Lebanon face? We can talk about infrastructure. There have been voices about radicalization in the camps. And also a very important issue is how do the Palestinians and other refugees within Lebanon right now get along?
So, as I mentioned, their situation is very much vulnerable. The Palestinians are vulnerable. Why? Because, as I mentioned, they don't have full access to rights. Of course, we are not talking about the right of citizenship, because in Lebanon, this is a big taboo, which actually after the civil war got even inscribed within the Lebanese constitution explicitly for the Palestinians. But except of this, you can actually grant a lot of rights for these communities, like the access to the labor market, because a lot of them are actually going to good universities, and then they are unable to work within the Lebanese market, so they tend to immigrate. And actually, this is a sort of a policy motivated by the government. This is what they actually aim for. Since they cannot go back to their homeland, the Lebanese government is getting rid of them in this way. So they are just going out from the country.
So basically, the Lebanese government gives them education and then no job opportunities to use this education, which forces the Palestinians to leave. Is that right?
It's not them who are giving them. It's not the Lebanese government who is giving this education opportunity. It's mainly the UNRWA. They have UNRWA schools and other associations and NGOs who are providing them schooling. But yes, they are reaching very high level of education, and then they are somehow pushed to leave Lebanon because they have no opportunity in Lebanon. And this is why I mentioned it's kind of a policy from the Lebanese state to get rid of this problem.
This is rather bizarre, I must say. How about the life in the camps? What's going on in the camps? Well, there have been a lot of news about what's going on in the camps. How would you describe the situation?
So actually, as we were talking, and you can imagine such a camp, which is very much an informal structure, very highly densely populated with small alleys, etc., with no real services provided. So think about sewage system, electricity, even security is difficult to manage in these camps. And plus, since many Palestinians moved out of these camps, and this is actually a very interesting story, so to see the dynamics of different refugee groups. When these Palestinians got a little bit well and they moved out from these camps, as I mentioned, only half of them are still in camps. And these camps are established on informal lands owned by either big Lebanese families or the state. And they are considered as being totally illegal settlements, let's say, without any registry, cadastral registry, etc. So what is happening is that when the Syrian refugees arrived to Lebanon, starting 2011, many of their houses, of the Palestinian housing units within the camps, were rented out by these Palestinians to Syrians. Camps like, for example, Shatila, is at least half of the camp is inhabited by Syrians. So you also have a lot of other groups, migrant groups living there. I remember once going into Sabra, and on the outskirts of Sabra, there is a region called like Hayl Ghosh, which is also part of the informal settlement extension of Shatila. You have a Bangladeshi migrant community there, living there, established there. So they are renting out the houses of the former Palestinians who moved out from there. So to see these dynamics is very interesting. Of course, in such a marginalized setup, you might imagine that a lot of issues are emerging, social demands, frustrations, especially among youth, because these populations are usually very young. And we could see that during all the decades, this was the case, because the Palestinians actually from Lebanon, like in other countries also, got involved in the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, and other factions. And actually, they are a representative small microcosm of what is happening also in the Palestinian territories, mainly Gaza and the West Bank. In that sense, the same political parties that are thriving, let's say, in these Palestinian territories are also thriving within the Palestinian communities in Lebanon. So we have a presence of Hamas, we have a presence of Fatah, we have a presence of other Palestinian factions and organizations. And of course, these frustrated youth mainly are very much keen or a very easy recipient for these kind of ideas, because at the end, they see themselves locked up in a never-ending situation in which they cannot return back to their ancestral home, but they cannot access fully rights in their country where they are hosted or they were born. Not even them, actually. For today, it's their fathers or grandfathers and grandmothers who were born in Lebanon and raised in Lebanon. So this is already the fourth generation. They are very much frustrated because they don't have any future view of their future.
What is the Lebanese government's response to all of this? And what is actually the legal status of the camps?
So the Palestinians, upon arrival, as I mentioned, they established themselves in camps. And these lands were allocated by the state. Some of them were allocated by some religious organizations. It's always funny, people forget that in Dubai, in the northern outskirts of Beirut, you have a Palestinian Christian camp. So Christian Palestinians were established in a separate camp, in the Dubai camp. And interestingly, these Palestinians were naturalized as Lebanese later on, because Christian Palestinians were seen as boosting the Christian demographics in Lebanon during the Christian elite influential decades. So what we call the political Maronitism. So when the Maronites were ruling Lebanon, starting from the independence up until the civil war. But also, never forget that the state is very pragmatic, because the rich Muslim Palestinians were also actually naturalized. And actually the capital that came from Haifa, from Jaffa, from big cities in Palestine, they actually helped to boost the Lebanese economy, which is nowadays referred as being the golden age of Lebanon. But many historians now agree that it was also partially boosted by the Palestinian capital flow to Lebanon during this period.
So despite all odds, there is a significant social strata of the Palestinians in Lebanon that actually have been granted permanent residence, if not citizenship. they are considered a boost to the economy and to the society, right?
They were granted citizenship.
Mhm.
So these, we're talking about 10%, and in the very few years following their inflow to Lebanon, they were granted Lebanese citizenship. And some of them created banks in Lebanon, like Bank Intra, which later on had a bankruptcy. We're facing bankruptcy in the 60s. But a lot of them are nowadays very well-known figures of the Lebanese economy. They are very successful entrepreneurs because actually their families were already very big entrepreneurs within Palestine before 1948. So these were actually naturalized. It's only the Muslim Sunni poors who remained without nationality and are still considered as being refugees and very much vulnerable. As for the legal status of the camps, so as I mentioned, they entered, they settled on these lands, they established themselves in these camps, and then they became later like a sort of a favela. And these were owned by state or by big families up until we all know that starting the mid-60s, the Palestinian guerrillas, the Palestinian fighters from the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, were moving there. They were pivoting into Lebanon. And the Palestinian camps became their best and strongest general quarters and places to thrive, especially after they were expulsed from Jordan after the Black September episode, in which a lot of these fighters, the Palestinian fighters, came into Lebanon and established themselves in the Palestinian camps of Lebanon. Prior, just 1-2 years before that, the Lebanese government, and actually without the acknowledgement of the parliament, had what we call the Cairo Agreement. They went to Cairo, mainly it was represented by the head of the Lebanese armed forces at that time, together with the PLO, Yasser Arafat. They signed the document which granted Palestinians self-governance over the camps. So the Lebanese state actually lost its sovereignty on these territories. They were governed by Palestinian factions. Plus, they were able to go and do guerrilla actions against Israel from South Lebanon. So the Palestinian camps became a state within the state. And the south of Lebanon was so-called then the Fatah land, because Fatah could actually do guerrilla attacks against northern Israel, which actually led to a lot of retaliatory bombings and attacks from Israel towards not only the Palestinians, but also the Lebanese armed forces and Lebanese villagers, civilians during that period. And this is why actually the Palestinians slowly but gradually were one of the main causes of the degradation of the situation in Lebanon and the entering into the civil war in Lebanon. Of course, the civil war has many other causes, mainly socio-economic causes. The economic elite was not able to give any of the revendications of the social movements in Lebanon. So they turned it into a sectarian kind of clash. But the Palestinians, because of their actions and their reivindications, were actually involved in this war. And from the other side, you had the right Christian parties, and it was the best ingredients for a huge deflagration, which ended up in the civil war.
From what you're saying, probably the listeners also understand that the Palestinians in Lebanon are actually a lot more influential or have a lot more influence over regional politics than we would like to admit. What is their connection to the events in Gaza and the West Bank in the past years?
As I mentioned before, the Palestinians of Lebanon are a microcosm of the Palestinian societies of Gaza, of the West Bank, etc. So you have the same dynamics going on, especially that the camps are still more or less self-governed. So you have the Lebanese army who is actually controlling the outskirts or surrounding these camps, but the management of these camps from the insides are managed by the Palestinian factions. When I say Palestinian factions, it's the replica of what you have in Palestine. So for a long period of time, you had the Fatah from one side and the Hamas from the other side. And since they were fighting, you remember when the Hamas took over control of the Gaza Strip in the 2000s, you had the same happening within the Palestinian camps. So it's an echo to what's happening there. So you recurrently had rounds of clashes between Palestinian factions within these camps. Last of which was happening just before October 7 in summer 2023, where you had really an Ain al-Halwa camp in next to Saida in South Lebanon. You had real clashes with RPGs, with B7s, with bombs between the Palestinian factions. Noteworthy also to know that a lot of radical Islamist jihadi groups were thriving within these camps because there's no much security presence. And you had groups like, for example, Daesh, ISIS, and other groups also who were actually developing and finding themselves a safe haven within these camps. This is the case, for example, of the northern camp in North Lebanon, the camp of Nahr al-Barid, where in the late 2000s, you had a jihadi movement who actually had a clash with the Lebanese forces, which ended up in the Lebanese army of attacking, besieging, bombing, destroying the camp, moving out the population. And then now the Palestinians went back, but it's fully controlled by the Lebanese state. So this is one case where the sovereignty came back to the Lebanese state.
Thank you. The camps are also increasingly being mentioned in connection with drug trafficking. What can you tell me about that?
As you can imagine, when you have a place that is very much concerned by poverty, marginalization, lack of services, education, lack of governmental control, because when you have factions, Palestinian factions ruling, you know very good that this is not like having the state ruling these kind of areas. So a lot of maybe neighborhoods within the camps are falling out of the control of any force. So many places within these camps had been subject to drug trafficking because non-political actor was actually taking control there effectively. This is the case of some of the camps, like, for example, Shatila camp, and it's not Palestinians who are actually running these. You have Palestinians, but you have Lebanese wanted persons thriving there. And you also have Syrians and people from different nationalities. So naturally, these places became a place where drugs were being sold, like the Captagon and other kind of drugs. And we've seen in the past years how a lot of people, youth even, were going there to get these drugs. We've seen videos where some even young women or young men from other regions, even from Christian regions, were actually going there to buy drugs and go out from there.
Sounds a little horrifying. We are leaving our listeners with a rather grim image of the situation of the Palestinians in Lebanon and the Lebanese response to all the events. Thank you, Dr. Elias Dahrouge, for this rather sobering discussion, and I'm looking forward to meeting you again. Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity, and see you soon.
Thank you for listening to the Khayrion podcast. We are looking forward to sharing with you more exciting news on the politics and business of the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. For further information, please follow us at khayrion.com, as well as on X and LinkedIn.